And welcome back. We are going to continue looking at the scanner class. Specifically, we're going to add a couple more methods into our toolbox so we can get more kinds of input that we can use. So if you recall, when we looked at the scanner class, we looked last time at two methods, nextInt and nextDouble. And those two were very helpful because nextInt allowed us to get an integer from the user, whereas nextDouble allowed us to get a decimal. So it was a pretty nice little toolkit. However, it didn't let us get everything that we might want. So let's say we want to get a string value. We want them to type in, let's say, their name. Well, we are going to need additional methods into our toolkit to be able to do those sort of things. If we don't have strings, well, obviously we're missing out on values that we can use. So the first method we're going to look at is one called next. This method is simply just going to read in the next word that is typed by the user. This is really good at capturing pretty much a single word or a single character string. So for example, I have a string called word1 and I set that equal to keyboard.next. You know, so it's just next. There's no next string, next double, next character, and it's just .next. If the user types, let's say, the word jelly bean, the value of jelly is stored with word1 and bean would be discarded because, again, it's only taking in that first line, that first word. And how does Java know that it's a word? Well, it's looking at white spaces. So whether you're pressing enter or you're pressing a space bar or a tab, it's using that white space and saying, hey, this is the end of a word, so therefore that's all that next needs to read in. And again, that white spacing is just a way for Java to tell where does that one word start and where does that next word begin. Now, if we want something more than simply just, one word, we need to use next line. And this one we'll probably use fairly frequently. This, of course, is going to work exactly the same as next, except instead of reading in one word, it's reading a whole line of text. The value of the string is then stored until the user either presses, enter or, has some kind of, new line termination, which will, of course, create a new line. So, for example, I have a string line is equal to keyboard.nextLine. And, very common thing, make sure you type out the word line. There's no abbreviations here. It's not like our print line statement, which is ln. This one is actually spelled out, line. So, if we look at an example, we say, let's say the user types, hello, are you feeling, okay? I'm good, thanks. The program's only going to store this first line of code. It's not going to get the second line of code. In fact, most of our compilers, if you try to put in both of these lines of code because you hit enter here, that will register as the end of that line and you won't even get a chance necessarily to enter this next line. Now, there's a couple things we need to talk about where escape sequences start coming into play here. So, for example, when we're using next line, the keyboard will start reading wherever the last reading stops. So if we had, let's say, two different lines, or we had just a next or a nextInt, how does that all play together? So let's look at this with some code. Suppose we get some inputs here. We have int n equals keyboard.nextInt, string 1, s1 is keyboard.nextLine, s2 is keyboard.nextLine. So we have a nextInt, a nextLine, and nextLine. And here's two different outputs just to see how these work. So here I say two heads are, new line, better than, new line, one head. And then if I look at the last line, I got 2, and then I hit a new line, heads are better than, new line, one head. Now, this is very important to note because nextInt does not automatically move our cursor here. It's not going to go ahead and automatically move that cursor. NextInt will keep that cursor here on this line. And so, if you look at how this works, nextInt is going to, of course, get the value of n to 2, and then S1 would then get the value heads are because it's, again, right here on the same line. And then, of course, S2 would be better than. If we look at the last line, n is still 2, but S1 is now an empty string, all right, because that cursor has not yet moved down. And this is a common thing that people could get tripped up on when you start thinking about how that input works. And then S2, of course, is going to get heads are better than because it's getting this whole next line. So the key thing to remember here is that when you start doing some of these input things, remember nextInt, nextDouble, and next all will keep that cursor on that line until there is some sort of way for that carriage return to come over and start reading in that next line of code. Now, one thing I want to make sure we discuss is this concept known as the empty string. Now, a string object, as we know, can have any length of characters. So, for example, the string hello with an exclamation point has 6 characters in it. However, we can have a string with 0 characters in it. This is called an empty string. So, for example, string empty str is equal to open and close quotation marks. There's technically nothing here in this string, but it's considered to be empty because we don't have any actual characters entered within those quotations. This actually occurs more often than you might think. So, for example, we do a next line method and the user just hits enter. Well, if we did that, we would just create an empty string. And technically, if we do a system.out.println with nothing in those parentheses, we're actually technically printing out an empty string. We just don't see it because, again, there's nothing there to be printed. Now, one of the last concepts we want to talk about is this idea of prompting and echoing user input. No matter how advanced we kind of get in our input, one thing we want to kind of do is have a prompt for our users to let them know that a program's ready to receive data. So, for example, system.out.println, please type a number. It's not anything too complex, it's just giving a little bit of directions. And this is really helpful because if we just start up a program and it's just sitting there waiting for us to give input, but we don't know what type of input to expect, then having a prompt is a great way for us to give a little bit of direction to the user to say, hey, I'm waiting to receive a specific type of data. Now, until we learn later on how to start verifying or sanitizing inputs, a great way to check what we've typed is to echo back what the user has actually typed. And the way the user can check that is to just, at this point, just make sure they're entering things in correctly. So if we jump on over here to Eclipse, let's go ahead and take a look at some of those different methods. So, of course, I went ahead and already created my scanner. Don't forget that you need to import the scanner class. So I'm just going to go ahead and create a string. I'm going to call this one input. And let's go ahead and create a int, and let's just call this num. And notice I'm not setting them equal to any values right now. I'm just creating them. All right, I could create them later. That's perfectly fine. But I'm just going to leave these here for now. And what I want to do is I'm going to say system.out.println because this is me creating a prompt for my user. I'm going to say, please enter a, how about your name, followed by a, how about your favorite number. Perfect. So we got the user entering their name followed by their favorite number. And then what we want to do is store those in there. So maybe I'm going to rename this to string name, and I'm going to call this now favnum, just to make those more appropriate variables. So let's do name is equal to kb.next. Now, of course, I can just do next if I'm expecting just a first name. But notice I didn't expect here to say, do I just want one name? Do I want two names? So in this case, next line is actually going to probably be a better choice for me. So I'm going to do next line, and then I'm going to do favnum is equal to kb.nextInt. All right, and if we run this right now, just as it is, wait for our program to build. All right, we see our prompt come back here, so it's waiting for our name. So let's go ahead and type a name, and let's type a number. And you can see it takes those in, but it doesn't do anything because, again, we fed these in, but we didn't actually ever print these out. So let's just go ahead and just print those out. So system.out.println, because again, I'm just going to put these in two different ones. So I'm just going to do name, and then I'll just do system.out.println of favnum. All right, and you can see it just prints those right back out. This is simply just echoing out that input here. And now one thing to keep in mind here is that these, of course, are both print line statements, and this was a next line statement here. And so this, of course, doesn't, of course, run us into any issues. However, if we had, let's say, done more of these. So let's just say I had a string in here. Let's just call this one, let's just make this one input just for the sake of simplicity. And we're going to do kb.next here. So there you go. So we have a kb.next in there. I'm not going to worry about inputting this one because this is just for demonstration purposes. So I'm just going to go ahead and put this in here. I'm just going to put a word, and let's put our number, All right. Now, notice it didn't print it out because I didn't tell it to, but this didn't cause any issues. Where we might come into some of these issues is, let's just say I'm going to switch favorite number first. All right, I'm not going to worry about this because I'm just testing this out. All right, and if we go ahead and run this now, all right, we got to make sure we put an integer in first. So let's just go ahead and put 2 in, and then we'll put our name, and then notice it's terminated. All right, so we have a blank line here, and I'm going to actually just add in one of these other print line statements here, just so we can see what input has done. All right, and we're just going to put that same input. So I'm going to hit 2, hit enter, and then type my name, and it has terminated. And so you notice it'll say David and then 2, but notice that there was never actually anything given for that other input statement. That's because, remember, this right here, this next line, is still technically on this. And I'm going to show that. If I run this one more time, so let's just put 2, I'm going to put David here now, and then hit enter, and then let's just say hi. You see that now we are, of course, pulling in that other string. So this shows you how the next line will feed from that. And additionally, you'll notice there's a space here. All right, so that would be something that we might have to deal with if we were trying to clean up our inputs. So it's generally speaking, when you're going to get inputs, it's always good to make sure, if you can, to try to get those on the next line, because you get those nice clean inputs. You don't have to worry about things like spaces here. But that's a nice, good demonstration of how we can use some of these various methods, whether it's next or next line or int, to go ahead and get a lot more control over our program.